Hello everyone, welcome to our video lecture series for our class Community Governance and Mobilization, or OSDCOGM. It's basically an introduction to community organizing and development. So basically this course familiarizes the students with the fundamentals of governance and mobilizations as tools of community development. So we'll talk about institutions, organization, and processes in relation to community governance and organization. It also provides you the opportunity to engage with people in marginalized communities as a part of service learning. So for this video, we'll talk about the very first lesson in this particular course, and that's communities and human systems. Here are the topics that we'll be covering in this particular video lectures. One, we'll be talking about community, the different types of community. We'll also talk about systems thinking in community organizations. And then we'll talk about community systems, the different systems that are found in a community and how they interact with each other. And then we'll also talk about kaleidoscopic communities, what that means and what are the different components of kaleidoscopic communities and how do they interact with each other. So basically, the accompanying reading for this particular video lecture is for the chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Joyce McKnight's book on community organizing. So first, let's review what a community is. So maybe you have already discussed about communities as a social construct in your sociology and anthropology classes, and maybe you've also had a conversation about this even way back in your senior high school. But for this class, we'll kind of segmentize that concept into common and unity. So common means that the people found in a particular community share commonalities. They share patterns that makes them the same. And then of course there's some sort of unity, meaning that people in a particular community know that they are in a community, and despite certain diversities, they can feel that they are united in some way. So McKnight formally defines communities as those being comprised of people who share common bonds, often feel responsible for the well-being of one another, and work together for the betterment of life for all. And discussing communities in a collectivist culture such as the Philippines and other Latin American and Southeast Asian countries is very important, in the social life of a particular person in the Philippines to talk about community, because we really survive because we have large social capital, we have ties with people around us, compared to the global north, who's usually very individualistic. Not to say that when you're in the global north you don't have a sense of community or collectivism, but it's just that in the global south, where the Philippines is, there's really just more collectivism happening. And that's why studying community in these particular areas is very important, because that's a part of our social life, it's a part of our well-being. And now we'll talk about different types of communities. The first type of community is a geographic community. A geographic community is basically a place where people live in proximity to one another and share daily life experiences. So there are many types of communities, as we will be explaining in this particular section, but most of the communities that we'll be talking about in this particular course is mainly about geographic communities. Communities that are basically found in a geographical location. There are clear boundaries, geopolitical boundaries of where this community can be found. The different units and elements of this community, they live in proximity to each other, and the proximity is what makes this a particular community, and also influences the functions of the people and the units and the elements in that particular community. And also, it's very important to note that communities that are geographic in nature have a sense of history. So it means that there's a temporality in terms of the relationships built among the people and the households and other institutions found in that particular community. And this history further ties them together, not just because we're close to each other, we're proximate to each other, but it's also because we have a shared history. We experience certain seasons together. We have certain yearly or annual or seasonal changes that we experience. And when I say seasons, it's not like the rainy season or the dry season. It's really more of like, you know where the fiesta is, so that's a history that you have the same culture. So yeah, so that's when you talk about geographic communities, it's both, you know, the geography, the proximity to each other, and a shared history. And sometimes many of geographic communities, the ties are intergenerational. So there is a foothold, no? The people have foothold in this community. They have dependence, they have rootedness in these particular communities. And sometimes when we talk about communities like this, geographical, the land is very important, right? Because if people have history with the land, they have attached a lot of their identity, collective and individual identity, to the land. And so it's very important. It's a part of the community. You know, the land is the part of the community. The space is a part of the community. The seasons, the weather is part of that community. And so we remember all of this when we talk about geographic communities, because, you know, when we try to develop and organize and mobilize people in these particular communities, you have to take this all into account, that they share not only a geographic location, they also share history, they share relationships across generations, they share seasonalities, they share the same weather, they breathe the same air. And that's important when we plan things with these particular communities. Now, the most basic differentiation within geographic communities are urban versus rural areas. You may already know the differences between the two, and you may already know that there are, you know, some other types of communities, especially in more, you know, in the global north. You have probably suburban communities, you know, but for this conversation that we'll have, this particular video, we'll talk about the urban and rural divide first. And so, of course, when you talk about the urban, you talk about, you know, you think about the city, you think about modernity, you think about spaces that are filled with so many people, where you have many products and services that are, you know, very much related to modernity. Compared to a rural area, maybe you think about, you know, provincial areas. Isip nyo yung probinsya, maybe you're also talking about, you know, mostly agricultural work, right? And then these are the municipalities, the barrios, the towns, you know, and this is outside the city center. So yun yung ating rural areas. This table is a pretty old table. It's in 1987, but there are still many themes that are found in this table that we see even today. There might have been some sort of demographic, geographic changes, but, you know, 90% of what we'll be discussing in this particular table, it remains the same. So, for example, in terms of the economic dimension, urban communities, no, they are dominated by secondary and tertiary activities, meaning we work with, you know, products and services that are already intermediate to finished product levels, compared to rural areas wherein, you know, the activities that are found in that rural area is really primary, so really agricultural, very domestic, right? So those are the main differences, no? So more specs or more signs of modernity in the urban areas. In terms of occupational structure, we find more manufacturing, construction, service activities. Actually, now when you think about it, you really have more service oriented. When you go to the fourth industrial revolution, you know, we think more about services, we think about technological jobs, and that's urban. But also manufacturing, factories, construction, administration, these are also found in urban areas. While in rural areas, we have more agriculture, we have more domestication of animals, farming, fisheries, forestry. So these are the industries that are usually found in particular rural areas, and usually the economic systems in rural areas are really, you know, the services that are being produced, the products that are being produced are servicing those that are within the rural areas, and also those servicing in urban areas. But usually it's not the same with the urban areas. Urban areas, they usually do not service rural needs, no? But rural areas, they service both rural needs and urban needs. So that's basically how, the goods and services kind of flow in relation to urban and rural areas. Next, in terms of education levels and provision, of course, we know that, just go to NCR, you have so many universities and colleges in NCR, while you have a few colleges and universities in rural areas. You find, people that have higher educational attainment to be working in and living in urban areas compared to rural areas. Another would be is the accessibility to services. So we know that, in urban areas, you think of NCR, you have all the specialty hospitals here. You have all the, the leisure and recreational services here. You have also a lot of the government agencies that are found in NCR. As compared to rural areas, you only have very few hubs of government agencies. In rural areas, you don't have very specialized hospitals and services in the rural areas. So yeah. And then also in terms of accessibility to information, urban areas, they're kind of high because mainly the first ones that get internet connections are also within the urban areas, because of course that's where you expect a lot of the needs for these particular services compared to rural areas. In terms of the demographic characteristics, we find that in urban areas, there's a delay in marriage, a delay in fertility, low fertility, but also low mortality. So there's lower deaths due to diseases during this time, because again, we go back to the accessibility of services, like the specialty hospitals are there. It's easy to find a doctor, and also the needs in relation to wellness are also there. You have more gyms probably there, right? Compared to rural areas wherein, there's high fertility, which is also, very much related to modernity. The more a certain community is, demonstrating facets of modernity, the lower the fertility is in that area. But since there's more agricultural, it's often correlated with high fertility rates. Usually marriages are earlier in these areas, and then of course there's high mortality because of lack of services in relation to health. I guess if there's one change that we would see from this table from what we see now is the politics, and usually a traditional view of urban and rural divide in terms of political ideologies, that we expect more radical liberal thinking within, city centers compared to rural areas who tend to be more conservative and traditional. I think that's true, but there are definitely political ideological shifts. But again, you talk about, more dominant thinking is still within these areas. And then in terms of ethnicity, urban areas are more varied because it's very much related to migration levels, wherein we expect that there's more rural, there's more net in-migration, from rural to urban areas. Or even you can think about, rural centers eventually becoming urban centers. And so, the increasing urbanization, gets to attract more people, into these areas, because again, that's where you have a lot of economic activity, that's where you have a lot of educational opportunities, a lot of accessibility to, a diverse set of services. And so that's why you expect a lot of in-migration, and so you expect more ethnic diversity in these particular areas compared to rural areas wherein you expect generally homogeneous ethnic minorities and lesser people going in rural areas. Yeah. Now within geographic communities, we have, the partial geographic communities wherein you have smaller geographic areas within geopolitically identified barangays, for instance. So for example, you have smaller residential areas like subdivisions or compounds in a particular community, or probably you have the sitio. And then you also have the complete institutions. When you say complete institutions, these are areas wherein you find people, kind of congregate for a certain period of time, or probably in a more perpetual manner, like for example prisons. But college campuses, for particularly in urban areas wherein people from the province, they migrate to the capital in order for them to study, and they kind of build a small geographical location wherein they kind of become more proximate to each other. So college campuses, schools, nursing homes are also communities, because especially when older people retire there, they kind of build a sort of foster of sense of a community. And of course, military areas are also institutionalized communities. And then we also have what we call dispersed communities, and this is also what we see in countries and in areas where there's more diversity. So you have groups of people who share common sense of purpose, history, and a sense of duty to one another, although they may be scattered across the world. Like for example, you have a dispersed community of overseas Filipino workers. So these are communities, they don't necessarily have to be proximate to one another, but they identify being a community of Filipinos with a certain heritage, a diasporic community, but they don't have to be living with each other, but they identify to be a part of that community. May sarili silang mga laban, they have their own struggles, and there are ways that we can empower and mobilize these communities even if they are not proximate to each other. And other examples of dispersed communities may be ethnic and religious groups. So maybe, for example, in the Philippines, you find Chinatown, but also that's an example of a partial geographic place. But you have Chinese Filipinos all over the Philippines. They have their struggles, they have their aspirations that are common because of their cultural background. And of course, you have migrant indigenous peoples migrating from the province to the capital, right? And then of course you have religious groups, and you have immigrant communities such as the OFWs in elsewhere. And then you have also communities of interest. So communities of interest are primarily organized around people with shared concerns or interests that are important components of their individual identities, but they may not be geographically or culturally bound, or this is not really because it's based on ethnicity, nationality, or religion. So probably an example of a community of interest would be, for example, the Philippine Sociological Society as an example of a formal community of sociologists, right? Or maybe you have Philippine Nurses Association as a formal association of nurses, or maybe you have a community of Mobile Legend gamers or Pokemon Go communities. That's an example of an informal community of interest where you're bound together. You have certain aspirations that align with each other, but you don't have to be necessarily within the same area. Alright? And then you also have what we call virtual communities. It's a new and constantly evolving phenomenon that exists online and shares some characteristics of all communities, such as formal and informal rules of interaction, role expectations, primary relationships, subsystems to handle various issues, thematic boundaries, and stability across time. And this is very much embedded with whatever digital and communicative affordances a particular app has. For example, in my case, I used to be a part of a community that's really built on SoundCloud, but since SoundCloud got a little bit defunct because of Spotify, that community kind of loosened and we're not as close-knit anymore. But that community was built on that particular application, and then there's some multimodality because we also meet Facebook, but there's also a blended mode because we also meet each other in person. We go to open mic. So that's an example of a virtual community. It was built, and majority of its interaction is done virtually. However, in this class, we'll not be covering a lot of virtual community development because you have a separate subject in relation to cyber communities and cyberspaces. So I'll leave that to your professor in that particular subject to discuss that. Now, in the second chapter of McKnight, they discuss the importance of engaging in a systems thinking in order for us to be able to serve our clientele in the communities much better in a more organized and systematic way. Systems. And I think it's also very fitting that we use this because your majors are also social systems development. So systems thinking, you've been trained to do this. So it's really just a review. Or maybe you may find that some of the concepts and the constructs that we'll be discussing in this section of the discussion is a bit different, but you'll be able to find some connections with your social systems conversations in your earlier subjects. But basically, McKnight argues that systems thinking is an analytical approach that allows us to perceive relationships and processes among the parts of a whole. And I think that separates behavioral scientists, social scientists, sociologists, and anthropologists from other people doing community organization, is that we have to think of relationships and individuals as part of a larger system, and also having their own systems of doing, feeling, thinking, cooperating, having conflicts, resolving conflicts as well. And so it's very important that, when we think of community organizing, we always have to think about the focal community system. We have to think about, what is my target? What is my focus in terms of problematizing and, building efforts in an organization? This is not to say that the focal community is the only area where you'll be working. It just means that this is where you kind of place everything in perspective. So that's the focal community system. So it's really important that the community that we decide to place our focus into when we try to practice organization and development should have been existing over a reasonable period of time. And I think temporality is very important in a community. We've discussed that a little bit earlier about history, about generations, building subcultures within that community, building patterns, having some social story and narrative connections among the people is very important, because if you want to organize people, there has to be a historical commonality that they share. So it can be easier to kind of build trust, to kind of build on people's already established relationships and resources. They also should have established roles to which people interact in predictable, ongoing patterns. This may differ from, there are national patterns that we see that are the same. There are folkways that we share, but there are also folkways and things that we do that are different in a particular community or another. And maybe you have experienced that. You were going to a particular senior high school other than LaSalle, and then there's a certain way of doing enrollment, certain way of eating in the canteen, certain way of doing, assignments, certain way of dealing with your teachers, calling your teachers by their name or whatever. And then when you go to LaSalle, they serve the same function. You eat in the canteen, you enroll, you deal with your teachers, you do your assignments, but there are nuances of how these are done, basically based on the affordances that we have, the technological affordances, the geographic affordances. But basically, they serve a similar function, but the nuances are there, the patterns are different, the behavioral expectations are different, and the focal community should have some form of standard, whether that's codified or not codified. And that is as outsiders coming in, as community organizers coming in a particular community, that's one of the things that we do. We'll do a little bit of ethnography, a simple, quick ethnography, try to study the methods of people doing certain things, whether that's codified or not codified, whether that's formal or informal. And that is kind of where we kind of base whatever development we want to do, whatever we want to mobilize. But there has to be some form of established roles. But sometimes you may be brought to a community wherein the rules are not established yet because of conflict or because of a disaster. Just imagine, no, everyone, after a very, 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 very strong earthquake, and everybody, houses are decimated, buildings are decimated, supply chains have been disrupted, and people don't know how to, and so as community organizers on the ground, maybe this is the first thing that we have to look at, Let's establish the rules. Let's establish some sort of normalcy. Let's establish some form of commonality, expectation, some form of norm. Develop that, But I guess that is conversations around disaster times, no? But particularly, we'll talk about, general community organizing. We look for our community that in some way have some form of cultural fluidity already. So, yun yung focal community that we're talking about here. And then, a focal community system would be something that has microsystems already, and we'll talk about microsystems in a while, but these are smaller divisions in the community which also have their own subcultural units and nuances, but they also contribute to the whole. That means specific needs or represent specific populations and interests. They have an equilibrium or balance or power that is relatively stable over time. And then, like I said, the focus for our community organization are really more geographic, But we can also look at ideological boundaries, like, again, talk about dispersed communities. Limited to adherence of particular belief system based on social issues, like, for example, the rise of a particular minority group. So this may also be a community of interest. And or legally defined, such as a political district or a barangay or a sitio, right? Although I would consider a sitio as a microsystem under a barangay, And so, what are the different levels of system in human systems thinking? So we have the microsystem. So maybe you have seen this also in a socio-ecological way. You may be thinking Bonfim-Brenner, But yeah, that might be a little bit similar to this, but we have to talk about this not really as an individual, we talk about it as a community having microsystems inside it. So for example, when you talk about the barangay, these are compounds, probably, areas wherein people with intergenerational family backgrounds exist or they reside. You have blocks, yung mga streets, small esquinitas, and then you have the purok, probably smaller districts within the barangay. So, for example, I give you an example on a personal experience. I used to lead nursing students in a community in Cavite City, and this community in Cavite City is actually a reclaimed community. There's a reclaimed land from the other side of the Manila Bay, and so the houses are built on stilts. And so usually the smaller microsystems that you found there are the houses that are built on stilts, and then the part of the barangay that's built on the main land. And because their issues are different, like for example, the issues in the stilts, sorry for the graphic descriptions, but they have a lot of, sanitation and hygiene issues. I can just imagine, and I'll maybe make kwento of this when we are in class already because it's quite graphic. But of course, and then you have different issues in the land area, like for example, like obstructions because of the presence of those in stilts and so many other things, right? And this can be formal or informal groups in the community. Like for example, you have the neighborhood association, and then you have the youth groups, the women's groups, the senior groups. So this can also be microsystems. And again, you have to think of microsystems as smaller systems in the community that work together, in order to build the community better. And then microsystems are also specific sectors in the community, like school, work districts, particularly in the community in Cavite City, there are again the fisher folks, because their main source of living is fishing tilapia and also mussels, tahong. And also others naman, they make boats for the people who farm the tahongs or the mussels. And then you also have the kind of the general economic sector wherein you have the sari-sari store, those that are selling in karinderya or eateries, right? And then of course you have the schools there. There's a small chapel. Actually, the parish is walking distance, and that's their religious subsystem, in the community, and kind of gives some form of expressive role in the community. We'll talk about this in a while, or in a different discussion. But yeah, so those are the different sectors that can serve as microsystems within a community, a focal community of interest. And then you have your meta-systems, and meta-systems is the focal communities overlapping with other community systems. So for example, Barangay A is overlapping with Barangay B, and probably in that experience in the Cavite City experience is that, for example, you have a parish, and that parish usually services like 3 or 5 barangays. And so that parish is kind of the overlap of the meta systems. And so, for example, if the parish parang has a charity drive, a medical mission, then you would expect that these different barangays would communicate. So if your focal community is Barangay 8, your meta systems are the other barangays that are attached to the particular parish, and you have sort of shared, fiesta, or probably shared, religious and charitable activities. So that's an example of a meta system. It's, again, like I said, it's an overlap of different microsystems and can be a site of cooperation, syempre. And also, it's a site of conflict, right? I remember, in that particular community in Cavite City, like there's always, because the boundaries of one barangay to the next, just an esquinita, a small street, and then the rest is water, murky water, and then sometimes, in terms of resources, or when a tree is planted, whose tree is that? Is that for Barangay A or Barangay B? And other conflicts, like of course there can be violence, there can be disputes in terms of land ownership, right? Etc. etc. The next is the mezzo systems. So mezzo systems are actually the political, economic, and cultural systems that surround and support your focal community system and have a direct or indirect impact on the success of your community organizing efforts. So examples of these are for example, the codified systems that are your ordinances, right? The schedule when the garbage truck is going to, come to the community and collect the garbage. So that's an example of, these services, these policies, right? What are the different social services that are offered by the barangay? And this can also get higher, like what are the city or the municipality's policies. So that's also a mezzo system. So those are political, economic, because those are codified. But you also have cultural systems. So like practices, what are the expectations? How do we treat the elderly? How is power situated in a particular community? What are the different mores, folkways that are expected by people to be done in that particular community? So again, we talk about both codified and non-codified behaviors, collective behaviors that are expected. So this is a mezzo system. So it's kind of the intangible things, most likely the beliefs, the ideologies, the systems. But you also have to remember that this is not like the culture with the big C. No, this is not the Filipino-ness. No, this is really more of like local cultures, local policies, local norms. I put here a little bit of regional and national laws because there are national laws that have local effect. Like for example, the BARM, the Bangsamoro Administrative Region, right? So there are national laws that are related to BARM, but the effect is only local. But again, you talk about mezzo systems, it's really local or regional, that's particular to that focal community of interest. This is also the web networks of public, private, and civil society spheres found in that particular community. And the norms, the symbols, talk about the different elements of culture, codified, not codified, and all of the institutions working particular in that focal community. That's your mezzo system. Next, you have your macro systems. It's basically the natural environment where that particular community is situated. So, for example, that Cavite City that I was talking about, that's a you have the natural environment of the sea, or the bay, where the stilts are built, and so that kind of places them in a flooding risk, that also and also being washed away by waves when there is a strong storm. So these are the macro systems. So the basically the natural environment, that's one. Number two is the broad economic environment. So if the mezzo system looking at the local norms, beliefs, practices, ideologies, this one is more of the big C of culture, so national level, and also including globalization. So how does national level laws, how does Filipino culture in general influences that community, focal community of interest, right? And of course talks about the social cultural environment, again from a larger national big C level. Now, McKnight also talks about the kaleidoscopic community system. So basically, you can imagine that the community systems within your focal system, focal community is kaleidoscopic. It has a lot of colored patterns, and whenever you move that, the tube of the kaleidoscope, there are shifts in the shapes and the shifts in the colors, and then every spin that you make, you create a different visual, right? And that's kind of how communities work, right? When a particular component of the community moves, you expect that other aspects of that community are affected as well. So the argument in kaleidoscopic community systems thinking is that we have to think of a focal community system as being understood through identifying its various people, groups, associations, and formal organizations. So it's very important that you get to know sino ba yung mga nakatira dito. What are the contingent and permanent groups that are being built in the community based on the activities and cultures that are found there. Associations that are being built there because of interest or certain common struggles, and also formal organizations that serve them by providing them goods and services, etc. Number two, a kaleidoscopic community system looks at these particular levels of individuals, quasi-groups, primary groups, associations, and formal organizations, and think that they are always interacting at different times, at different levels, at various circumstances. Whether that's in a time of usualness, of peace, lack of conflict, etc. But also in times of crisis, like conflict, disasters, etc. Number three, we also have to shine the light of both analytical reason and creativity on the whole process. We have to think about, how do individuals interact with quasi-groups, with primary groups, associations, and formal groups, and then how do each levels of the community system influence each other. So by context clues, we know that the individuals are the building blocks of the community. It's you and me, the he, the she, the they. In that community, the individual people, elements in that community, right? There's an argument that we can talk about people, but we can also talk about animals. But again, that's another conversation. But we talk about individuals. And the individuals influence. They cooperate with the other groups, or are they a part of the other groups as well, or the other levels as indicated here. We have the quasi-groups. groups or the almost groups. So the quasi groups are composed of members who share common characteristics and they have an emerging awareness of shared interest and they decide to act together. But the group is kind of contingent, right? So for example, they have interests or concerns. So for example, certain group of children, they learn that they are good in singing, so they kind of build a choir, amongst themselves, right? So, but eventually, these groups that are bound together by interest, they can eventually become primary groups. They become more permanent. So what are primary groups? So primary groups are the social groups that are really more permanent or less contingent than quasi groups. So of course you have the family as a primary group. You have the friendship circles as the primary group. So these are the non-formal social groups that are more or less permanent or more long-standing than quasi groups, right? And then we have associations. So associations are, larger, more organized groups of people that are working towards a particular struggle or a particular aspiration or ambition or a particular goal. Like for example, you have your youth associations, you have the association of fisher folks in the community. You may have an association of women in the community. You have an association of nagbebenta ng mga bagay-bagay sa palengke association. So these are, larger, a little bit more organized. So what is different between primary groups and associations is that primary groups, they are less contingent than quasi groups, but they are still very informal in general. But a little bit formal ang association, but they are not as formal as formal organization, which, has a laid out organizational structure with particular roles that are specialized among the people found there. They may be housed in a particular building, and there are really rigid rules within formal organizations. So, in a community, you expect to find individuals, you expect to find quasi-groups, you expect to find primary groups, you expect to find associations, and you expect to find formal organizations as well. And sometimes, when a quasi-group's interest is really, a struggle that needs to be addressed, the goal of a community organizer and their team is to kind of make that less contingent, more permanent, more organized. So for example, as we said, you have a group of youth, for example, they are frustrated that their artistry is not very much seen in the community. They can start off as individuals doing art together, right? And then when they feel like they have no audience, they kind of, may kwento with each other and say, you know what, I paint. Oh, I paint too. Then let's have a show and tell about our paintings. And then they form these quasi groups, and eventually they form a friendship. In time, they become each other's confidant, and they become friends, and they become primary groups. And then they realize that, you know what, this is a struggle that's worth fighting for. Maybe we can kind of, get a critical mass of other youth in our barangay who does a lot of art, and we feel like our art is not recognized. So maybe we can have an association, and maybe we can start, creating our own events, our projects, but we don't have a SEC registration yet. There's no leader in that particular group. We're just working together with a particular struggle or goal in mind, a particular aspiration in mind. And eventually, when this takes off, right, and you feel like you want to formalize this particular aspiration, you want to fight, or you want to be able to get through this struggle in a more formal way, then you organize and become a formal organization. So that is, and being a formal organization makes the efforts more concerted. It's more harmonized, it's stronger, it's more critical. And that's the goal. One of our goals in the community organizing is to organize people, especially when there are individual issues. Maybe we can put these individual issues together and then pull from each other's resources, whether that resources is physical, economic, mental, talent, whatever. And eventually build an organization so that this particular struggle or aspiration can be met with more precision than they would if they were just a quasi-organization. So that's one of the things that we do among the many things that we do as community organizers. And that's why it's important to look at kaleidoscopic community systems. There are those, of course, formal organizations that really don't have to go through individual quasi-groups. Like, for example, school is a formal organization. It doesn't go through being a quasi-group. It's there. The school is there already. But again, formal organizations like schools, government agencies, the church, the barangay leadership, which are more organized, they can help individuals, they can help quasi groups, about the struggles that they have, the aspirations that they want to meet, and so that's the kaleidoscopic community, whether in whatever group you are, in whatever systems you are, there is an opportunity for you to kind of interact and kind of move towards a particular goal. And our goal as organizer is, of course, one, do they know the problem? Number two, do they know do they feel what the problem is? Of course, the argument here is that they know what the problem is. When we help them kind of define that and streamline that problem, they have a critical mass. Are they conscientized? And then are they organized towards, solving that particular problem? Now, I'm getting ahead of myself here in terms of community organizing, but you get the gist. So in this video lecture, so we talked about these different concepts, and let me just enumerate them. We talked about the community, different types of community, including geographic community, partial community, dispersed community, community of interest, virtual community. We also talked about human systems thinking. And we also talked about the micro, meta, mezzo, macro systems and then the kaleidoscopic community systems thinking, where they have individuals, quasi-groups, primary groups, associations, and formal organizations. And we kind of had a few illustrations along the way, and also a little bit of patikim and some conversations around how do we do community organizing. Thank you so much.